United Nations Peacekeeping, 1946 to 1962, by Sanderson Beck. It is not by suppressing his views, but by forming his views on an independent basis and by consistently maintaining them that a Secretary General can gain and maintain the confidence on which he is dependent. Dag Hammarskjöld. My country has steadfastly pursued over the years a policy of non-alignment and friendship for all other nations, whatever their ideologies. In my new role, I shall continue to maintain this attitude of objectivity and to pursue the ideal of universal friendship. Uttant, November 3, 1961. In addition to the 5 permanent members with veto power on the Security Council, Britain, China, France, Soviet Union, and United States, the first elected members of the Security Council were Australia, Brazil, Egypt, Mexico, Netherlands, and Poland. Iranians complained that the Soviet troops had not withdrawn from Iran by March 2, 1946, as agreed in the 1942 Tripartite Treaty. But after the Soviets promised that they would evacuate by May 6th, the Iranians withdrew their complaint. Although the Ukrainian representative of the Soviet Union raised the issue of violence on the Greek-Albania border on August 24, 1946, when the United States proposed a commission to investigate, it was vetoed by the Soviet Union. On December 2nd, Greece complained to the Security Council that communist guerrillas in northern Greece were being assisted by Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. The Soviet Union did not block the commission that was sent at the beginning of 1947, though they disagreed with its reports and vetoed resolutions. So the United States took the case to the General Assembly, which on October 21, 1947, by majority vote, established the United Nations Special Committee on the Balkans, UNSCOB, to be composed from all 11 nations of the Security Council, though the USSR and Poland did not participate. After Yugoslavia became more independent and left the Cominform organization in 1948, the Greek communists received little support. UNSCOB was terminated in 1951. After Japan surrendered, Indonesia declared its independence on August 17, 1945. But the Netherlands, its former colonial overlord, tried to regain control, and the issue was brought to the Security Council, which on August 1, 1947, called upon both sides to cease hostilities and accept arbitration. A consular commission drawn from Australia, Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States went to observe the ceasefire. After fighting began again in late 1948, the Security Council again requested a ceasefire, and on January 28, 1949, asked the Consular Commission to provide military observers, MILOBs. With no more than 63 persons at any time, they were able to mark the ceasefire lines, supervise troop withdrawals, stop infiltration between lines, and investigate violations and damages to rubber plantations. By the end of 1949, the disputed territory had been transferred to the sovereignty of Indonesia. By 1947, the failure of the Security Council to organize the forces necessary for the collective security framework in which disarmament could have been established allowed the Cold War arms race to dominate the international scene. Meanwhile, the permanent members of the Security Council were getting around their partial ban of the veto if they were a party to a dispute simply by not calling it a dispute. In April 1947, British diplomats brought the issue of the League mandate over Palestine to the United Nations, and the Assembly appointed a special committee which proposed partition in November. But the plan was rejected by Palestinians and Arab states. In the last month of 1947 and the first month of 1948, the UN reported 2,778 casualties in Palestine, 1,462 Arabs, 1,106 Jews, and 181 British. After repeated calls for a ceasefire in April, on the 23rd, the Security Council established a truce commission for Palestine from representatives of Belgium, France, and the United States to supervise the requested ceasefire. On May 14, 1948, the General Assembly terminated the Palestine Commission and appointed a UN mediator. The next day, the United Kingdom relinquished its mandate, and on the same day, the Jewish Agency proclaimed the State of Israel. As the British withdrew their forces, Arabs invaded. On May 22nd, the Security Council called for a ceasefire within 36 hours and ordered the Truce Commission to report on compliance. A week later, the Security Council authorized military advisors to supervise observance. As the war continued, the number of military advisors grew to 572 and became known as the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, UNTSO. A 4-week truce expired on July 9th, and Arab governments refused to extend it. As fighting erupted again, the Security Council ordered a ceasefire and threatened Chapter 7 action. Both sides complied. On September 17, 1948, the UN mediator, Count Bernadotte, and a senior French observer were assassinated in Jerusalem by the Jewish terrorist Stern organization, and Ralph Bunche became acting mediator. On November 16th, the Security Council ordered an armistice, and all agreed except Egypt, which accepted it in January. Between February and July 1949, Israel made separate bilateral agreements with Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. The area of the partition that was to be Palestine was divided between Israel and Jordan, which got the West Bank, while Egypt gained the Gaza Strip. Israel was admitted into the United Nations on May 11, 1949. The mediator role was ended in August, but the UNTSO continued. India and Pakistan gained their independence from Britain on August 15, 1947. But Kashmir was unsure which nation to join. When Muslims from Pakistan invaded in October, Kashmir's Maharaja asked India for troops and agreed to join India. On the first day of 1948, India went to the Security Council and accused Pakistan of threatening international peace. Pakistan argued that Kashmir's accession to India was illegal and requested a plebiscite under United Nations supervision. India agreed, but only if peace was restored. On January 20th, the Security Council established the United Nations Commission on India and Pakistan, UNCIP, but they did not arrive in Kashmir for 6 months. In August, UNCIP proposed a ceasefire and submitted new proposals in December. On the first day of 1949, both India and Pakistan agreed on a ceasefire, and it was formalized 2 weeks later. The United Nations Military Observers Group in India and Pakistan, UNMOGIP, was implemented in February. On July 27, 1949, the Karachi Agreement established the ceasefire line, and any disputes were to be decided by the Commission's military advisor. The Commission was terminated in 1950, but UNMOGIP was still there in 1965 when hostilities broke out again. After Mao Zedong's communists took over the Chinese mainland and proclaimed the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949, Soviet delegates walked out of most UN bodies as a protest against China still being represented by the nationalist regime that held only Taiwan. Norwegian Secretary General Trygve Lie tried to get the Beijing regime seated, but the United States refused to recognize them as the government of China. During the spring of 1950, Secretary General Lee traveled to the capitals of the Big Four powers on a peace mission to improve the effectiveness of the United Nations. He proposed the following 10 points. Veto limitation on the Security Council Pacific Settlement procedures. International control of atomic energy. Arms limitation. A UN armed force. Universal membership in the UN. Private and intergovernmental technical and economic development. More use of the UN's specialized agencies. Human rights development. Peaceful decolonization. And accelerated development of enforceable world law. Unfortunately, these ideals soon gave way to the crisis in Korea. The armies of the United States and Soviet Union had occupied Korea in 1945 to accept the surrender of Japanese troops on each side of the 38th parallel. The United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea, UNTCOK, was established in November 1947. The next year, UNTCOK failed to persuade the Soviet Union to withdraw its troops from Northern Korea, and North Koreans refused to cooperate with UNTCOK. Thus, they did not participate in the elections that took place in South Korea on May 10, 1948. The next year, the UN General Assembly established UNCOK to continue the work of UNTCOK. And their peace observation function reported that on June 25, 1950, North Koreans using Russian T-34 tanks invaded South Korea. The United States also reported the attack by North Korea. Secretary General Lee considered this attack a violation of the UN Charter and asked the Security Council to take steps to re-establish peace. Since Soviet delegates were boycotting the Council because of China, it was able to vote 9-0 with Yugoslavia abstaining to direct North Korea to withdraw its troops north of the 38th parallel, requesting states to assist the UN and refrain from helping North Korea. North Korea ignored the resolution, and President Truman sent U.S. troops to South Korea. On July 7th, the Security Council established a unified command under the United States, and Truman appointed General Douglas MacArthur as UN commander. 14 other nations also sent troops to support South Korea. The UN forces were on the defensive in South Korea until General MacArthur led a landing at Incheon on September 15, 1950. UN forces retook Seoul, and by September 30th, they crossed north of the 38th parallel. On that day, Secretary General Lee suggested settlement terms, but these were ignored by MacArthur. And on October 7th, the United States got the General Assembly to adopt a resolution supporting UN forces moving north of the 38th parallel. The next day, MacArthur sent North Korea an ultimatum to cooperate in establishing a unified government. As South Korea's forces neared the Yalu River and the borders with China and the Soviet Union, Chinese volunteer forces aiding North Koreans began pushing them back south. On October 24th, MacArthur started using non-Korean troops, but they were driven back south of the 38th parallel. In November 1950, the Western powers also took advantage of Russia's absence from the Security Council to pass the Uniting for Peace resolution, which enables the General Assembly to recommend collective measures for maintaining peace if the Security Council does not fulfill its peacekeeping responsibility because of lack of unanimity among its permanent members. The USSR returned to the Security Council so that it could make effective use of its veto. Lee contacted the Chinese to negotiate a ceasefire, but the Chinese delegation left New York in December. By the end of 1950, the North Korean and Chinese forces had regained Pyongyang and Seoul. UN forces fought back, and by March 14, 1951, they had retaken Seoul once again. In the spring, seesaw battles were fought along the 38th parallel as Secretary General Lee and the Security Council called for a ceasefire. On June 23, 1951, the Soviet Union's UN ambassador Jacob Malik suggested discussions for an armistice, and 2 days later, the People's Daily of Beijing endorsed the idea. On June 27th, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko declared that the ceasefire should be separate from political problems. Armistice talks began on July 10th. Amid continued fighting in a military stalemate, negotiations dragged on for 2 years as Americans were accused of war crimes, and controversy whether prisoners of war were to be repatriated voluntarily or not delayed agreement. Guerrilla warfare was countered with aerial bombing of North Korea. In 1953, U.S. President Eisenhower's threat to use tactical nuclear weapons eventually stimulated agreement, and the POW issue was settled on June 8th. 10 days later, South Korean President Syngman Rhee allowed 27,000 North Korean prisoners to escape. North Koreans complained, and the United States agreed to enforce the armistice that was signed on July 27, 1953. In the 3-year Korean War, about 3 million Koreans died. About 1 million Chinese were killed, and 54,246 Americans lost their lives. This bloodiest of the hot wars during the Cold War alienated both superpowers from Secretary General Trygve Lie, and he was replaced by Swedish Dag Hammarskjöld on April 10, 1953. As of 2003, the United States still had about 37,000 troops at the 38th parallel enforcing the armistice. But in the next 2 years, many forces were removed to support the military occupation of Iraq. On July 19, 1956, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles announced that the United States would not finance Egypt's Aswan Dam, and a week later, President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. France and the United Kingdom took their case to the Security Council on September 23rd, and the next day Egypt accused Britain and France of endangering the peace. Most of the canal's shareholders were British and French, and English Prime Minister Anthony Eden ordered an Anglo-French invasion of Egypt while the foreign ministers of the three nations were negotiating a 6-point agreement mediated by Secretary General Hammarskjöld. President Dwight Eisenhower rejected the use of force, but on October 29th, Israel began the attack by parachuting a battalion into Sinai. The next day, the United States requested a Security Council meeting. Then, according to their plan, the British and French called upon both Egypt and Israel to retreat 10 miles from the canal or they would send troops, although Israel's forces were still more than 10 miles from the canal. Egypt rejected the ultimatum, claiming it was defending its sovereign territory. 2 days later, Anglo-French air troops attacked Egyptian air bases. On November 2, 1956, the UN General Assembly passed the resolution proposed by Dulles ordering the parties to withdraw to the 1949 armistice boundaries and ceasefire so that the canal could reopen. On the 5th, the UN General Assembly established the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF. By November 7th, British forces had landed at Port Said, and French troops had occupied Fort Fouad. But the British government agreed to the ceasefire that started that day. On November 24th, the General Assembly called for the withdrawal of all British and French forces, and their governments agreed to remove them by December 22nd. The United States pressured compliance from Israel, which delayed withdrawing from the Gaza Strip and Sharm el-Sheikh at the strategic Strait of Tiran. Israel would not allow UN troops on their territory, and thus they were all deployed on the Egyptian side of the border. UNEF was drawn from 10 countries and ranged from 3,000 to 6,000 during its mission for 10.5 years. During the Suez Crisis, police fired on a crowd of peaceful demonstrators at a Budapest radio station on October 23, 1956. Soviet tanks and troops soon entered Budapest, but ferocious Hungarian resistance caused them to withdraw on October 29th. However, a massive Soviet invasion began on November 4th, and within 4 days the uprising had been brutally suppressed. The UN Security Council met on the 4th, but the Soviet delegate vetoed an American resolution condemning the intervention. The General Assembly also condemned the invasion, but the Secretary General could do little in this sphere of influence dominated by a superpower. In February 1958, Egypt and Syria formed the United Arab Republic, UAR. In May, the murder of a dissident Christian newspaper editor provoked a civil war in Lebanon between those supporting pro-Western President Camille Chamoun and the mostly Muslims who opposed him. Armed resistance to the government stimulated Chamoun to ask for military assistance from the United States on May 13th. President Eisenhower agreed but said he would not support an unconstitutional second term for Chamoun. On May 22, Lebanon's UN delegate asked the Security Council to look into infiltration from Syria. After a pause to see if the Arab League could solve the problem, on June 10, the Security Council created the United Nations Observation Group in Lebanon, UNOGIL. The Soviet Union was opposed but abstained. After the pro-Western King Faisal of Iraq was overthrown by a military coup on July 14, 1958, Chamoun asked for American military support. At the same time, Jordan's King Hussein likewise asked for British help. U.S. Marines landed in Beirut the next day. 2 days later, British troops flew into Jordan, and the U.S. proposed transforming UNOGIL into an armed peacekeeping force, but the Soviet Union vetoed it. In August, the United States and the United Kingdom both recognized the new government of Iraq and sent identical letters to the UN General Assembly, offering to withdraw their troops. By December 1958, UNOGIL had withdrawn from Lebanon. In May 1960, Patrice Lumumba's party won a majority in both houses of the Congo, and the King of Belgium invited him to form a government. On June 30th, the Republic of the Congo became independent, but a few days later an army mutiny occurred. On July 10th, Belgian troops were deployed, and Lumumba appealed to Undersecretary General Ralph Bunche. The next day, pro-Western Moise Tshombe declared the secession of the rich mineral province of Katanga. Congo government ministers asked the U.S. ambassador to provide American troops to restore order. By the 14th, the Security Council had authorized Secretary General Hammarskjöld to provide military assistance as needed and called upon Belgium to withdraw its troops. But by July 19th, 10,000 Belgian troops had returned to the Congo, ostensibly to protect Belgian lives and property. While Lumumba was traveling in November, he was arrested and apparently killed while in custody. The Soviets then called for the dismissal of Hammarskjöld and a withdrawal of UN forces, but they gained no support. Secretary General Hammarskjöld sought a tougher mandate and went to the Congo himself. But on September 17, 1961, he was killed in a plane crash while going to meet with Tshombe. On November 3rd, U Thant of Burma became acting Secretary General, reflecting the sharp increase of new nations from Asia and Africa that expanded UN membership from 50 states to 103. That month, the United Nations operation in the Congo, ONUC, was further expanded by the Security Council to support the central government of the Republic of the Congo, while condemning the illegal secessionist activities of the Katanga revolt. A year later, U Thant was nominated by the Security Council and elected by the General Assembly to a regular 5-year term. U Thant developed a plan for drafting a federal constitution for the Congo, and U.S. President John Kennedy and Belgian Foreign Minister Paul-Henri Spaak threatened Katanga with severe economic sanctions if progress was not made toward unification. The next month, in December 1962, Outant asked for a boycott of key minerals purchased from Katanga unless duties were paid to the Adula government at Leopoldville. When fighting broke out, the Tshombe could not stop. UN troops occupied Elizabethville and Kaminaville on January 3, 1963, with little resistance and few casualties. The UN continued to have military success, and withdrawal of its troops was debated. The United States and other Western interests asked that the UN remain while Congolese troops were retrained. They were finally withdrawn in June 1964 as the Congo became an independent nation. ONUC was the most complex UN peacekeeping operation so far, employing nearly 20,000 troops, lasting 4 years and costing about $400 million. The Soviet Union, as with UNEF, refused to pay its share. The United Nations was nearly bankrupted, and the United States threatened a resolution to deny the Soviet Union voting rights, but they promised to pay their dues. Another decolonization effort in Indonesia was not as controversial. In October 1961, the Netherlands asked the UN General Assembly to administer West New Guinea during its transition to independence, but there was no acting Secretary General at that time. In December, Indonesia's Sukarno began infiltrating forces into the region and proclaimed that West Irian would join Indonesia in 1962. Pressure from the United States and a United Nations buffer enabled the Dutch to make a graceful withdrawal. In September 1962, the UN General Assembly endorsed the Dutch-Indonesian Accord of the previous month. By November, the Dutch forces had withdrawn, and on the last day of 1962, the Dutch flag was replaced by the Indonesian flag. The UN Temporary Executive Authority, UNTEA, transferred administrative control to the Indonesian government on May 1, 1963. Almost all of the 1,608 troops used in the UN Security Force, UNSF, were from Pakistan. However, the vote in 1969 that brought West New Guinea formally into Indonesia was dominated by Indonesian authorities.